We are moving on now to the rest of community ecology. Okay, so let's talk about some other relationships. Trophic relationships are the big one, and competition is another important relationship. But you also have symbiosis, and in a symbiosis and symbiotic relationship, organisms are closely associated with one another. It may not be a feeding relationship like a trophic relationship. And there are three types of symbiosis generally recognized. Parasitism, that one most of us get, right? That one's pretty simple, like deer ticks feeding off of an organism's blood, or a tapeworm, right? Things like that. Commensalism, where one organism benefits and the other organism is not harmed, but they're not benefited either. And okay, so these are review from Baby Bio, right? You had those before. Right, so this chart shows you the interactions that we were talking about, right? Here are the three symbiotic ones, and then look at competition and consumption as well. Notice consumption is very much like a parasitic relationship in that one benefits and the other is harmed. These are the trophic relationships. Notice also competition is generally thought of as a lose-lose. Generally, the competitors both lose out for the most part. But this is just kind of summarizing all of those relationships. When relationships do happen, often you get coevolution between the organisms in those relationships. So, for example, you have the mutualistic relationships between birds and the plants that they pollinate, right? Or bees and the plants that they pollinate. But here, if you look at hummingbirds, they find nectar by color, right? And that nectar is not an advantage to the plant. It really is just there to feed the animals, to attract the animals in. So the animals get food from it, but the way that the plant benefits is that the birds then get pollen rubbed off on them when they go in and feed, and then they rub that pollen off on the next flower when they go in to feed on the next flower, right? So it is mutualistic, but also the flowers make it easy on the birds. The flowers that got pollinated, obviously, through natural selection, were the ones that were the brightest, most tube-shaped flowers. And so those are the ones that proliferated in the environment. And the hummingbirds, in turn, had that long beak that is able to get down into the flower, and that's why that tube-shaped flower is important. Okay, so you have this kind of when you see plants that are evolved in a specific way to attract a very specific pollinator, that's usually the result of coevolution. And oftentimes plants can only be pollinated by one type of pollinator, so they evolve together. All right. Let's talk now about, we're going to start to transition toward ecosystem biology, and let's start talking about diversity, okay, and specifically biodiversity. Oops, there we go. This is also called species diversity, and you're going to be looking at Simpson's Diversity Index as a measurement of biodiversity. And Simpson's really is more of a species richness kind of diversity index, although it does take into account abundance, but really it's more dependent upon how many different species there are in the community, right? So species richness is the number of different species in the community, but you also have relative abundance. So you can have an area that's very biodiverse in species richness because it's got a whole bunch of different species, but it's got relatively few numbers of each species, right? Which means it's fragile in that if something happens to wipe out one of those species, then it really reduces the species richness. With small numbers, it's really easy to wipe out an entire species. But in general, we look at biodiversity as a measure of health of the ecosystem. When you have a very species-rich ecosystem, diseases are specific to the organism. So if a disease comes in and strikes, say, one type of tree in your ecosystem, that type of tree might die, right? You might lose it, but if you've got a bunch of other different species of trees in the ecosystem, you still have lots of habitats for animals. You've got food supply that's still varied. Excuse me. And, basically the ecosystem can go on. If you have less species richness and, a disease comes through, it's going to wipe out your entire population of that organism, and it could wipe out pretty much all of the trees, for example, in your area. You also have things like if one food source dies, there's our others. There's lots of opportunity for relationships to go on when you have a very rich, biodiverse ecosystem. All right, so here are some examples of how you would calculate or how you would look at different communities. So this has a species richness of 6, right? But notice species B, C, and F, and really only have one of each organism. Species E, there's 2. D is really 3. So the diversity is actually very, very tiny in comparison to this one here, where you have the same species richness, but the relative abundance is all the same, right? Okay. And here, this community has abundance of each species, but it's got one fewer number of species, so its species richness is only a 5. When you have biodiversity, when we look at biodiversity in terms of hotspots. And hotspots are areas where the biodiversity is threatened for some reason. Right now, there is a big problem here along the U.S.-Mexico border because of the construction of the border wall. It's being constructed in areas that are biodiversity hotspots, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding that right now. So biodiversity hotspots are places that we're looking at high proportions of plants and other species that are under threat for whatever reason, and we look at protecting those biodiversity hotspots. All right, also within communities, some other things to look at are species within the community that have a greater, more vast impact. So it's not just about having a biodiverse ecosystem. Oftentimes you have very impactful species within the community that are really important. And so losing one of those might be problematic or good for the environment if it happens. The one that we think of as the most positive is the Keystone species right here. It's not necessarily the most abundant, but it plays a role in a lot of different interactions within the community. And you can kind of do a thought experiment thinking about, okay, if I removed this from my ecosystem, what would the ecosystem look like, right? And what would be the result of removing it? And you can tell really quickly if there's a bunch of impacts you're dealing with a keystone species. So the prime textbook example is the sea otter. If you remove sea otters from their population, what happens is sea otters live in an area known as the kelp beds, and it's a protected ecosystem. And they eat sea urchins and therefore keep the sea urchin population in check. If you don't keep that sea urchin population in check, then what happens is the sea urchins overpopulate and start to eat the kelp, and then that destroys the whole ecosystem. The whole ecosystem crumbles, and you end up with flats where there's no kelp growing at all. And there are a lot of organisms that depend on those kelp beds to have offspring, to stay safe. There's a lot of reasons for them. And so you can see if you remove sea otters, you're going to have vast impacts on that ecosystem. So that's what a keystone species is. One we learned about in Baby Bio is the invasive species, right? We live in the South, so kudzu, remember that? These are species that are usually introduced by humans into an ecosystem, and unfortunately, they tend to replace the species that are there because they're brought in and they have no natural predators. no natural, they can outcompete usually because they don't have other environmental pressures on them that the species who are native do. So obviously kudzu, that was brought in the 1940s. It's a Japanese vine that was brought in to try to control erosion. And then it got out and it was problematic, right? There are lots of examples of these. One of the most extreme examples of how an invasive species can be problematic is the island of Guam. There are no birds on the island of Guam because of the brown tree snake. As people were sailing into Guam, the brown tree snake was hitching a ride on cargo vessels, and when the cargo was offloaded, the snakes would escape and go out, and basically the brown tree snakes ate all of the bird eggs on the island. So there are now no native birds on the island of Guam. So that's an extreme example of what an invasive species can do. Now, that's not the same as, say, a domesticated species. So, for example, if you look at North America, cows, pigs, chickens, not native, right? Those are not species that are native to North America. They were brought from Europe. The difference is that they're not considered invasive because they haven't replaced anything that's already here. Okay, so they weren't released into the wild. They were cultivated. They're kept here. Actually, sometimes I guess pigs get out and can go wild, but for the most part, they're not replacing anything that already exists. So that's why they're not considered to be invasive. Right, the dominant species, that one's obvious, right? Most abundant in the ecosystem, has the most biomass. And then you have these foundation species. Foundation species are often called the ecosystem engineers because they usually make physical changes to the ecosystem that may not be good. So beavers, for example, are foundation species. In most places, they're considered to be a nuisance because they just dam up rivers and creeks and streams and things like that. And when you've got water systems in urban and suburban areas, and even out in the country, that are managed to a certain extent, and people are depending on water supplies from certain rivers and things like that, when beavers get into your creek or your river and start damming it up, it can cause major problems. That's why they're considered to be a nuisance in most cases. There are also some species called facilitators that are foundation species but have a positive impact on the environment. Right? So here are predators and prey, right? Invasive species crowd out the native North American marshes. Introduced fungus wiped out the chestnut and the American chestnut tree, and then here is the brown tree snake. No birds on Guam. All right. All right. So this is looking at if you have a keystone species, a predator here that's present in the ecosystem, and then if you remove that predator, look what happens to the number of species in your ecosystem. Okay, so again, that's how you know you're dealing with a keystone species. All right, so let's talk now about changes to our communities, right? So now we're looking at what scientists, it's kind of controversial. Some of them say that changes are very orderly. Some of them say that they're not quite so orderly. They're a bit more chaotic. The idea that species or that communities will change in an orderly fashion over time is called succession. Okay, and it always begins with a pioneer species, and it's usually an R selected species, but it ends with a stable climax community that's usually some sort of K selected species. In general, what happens is organisms come into an area and they make enhancements or at least changes to the area. And those changes that they initiate and eventually complete change the ecosystem to the point that it's no longer habitable for them, but it's actually more hospitable to the next thing in the successional line. Usually we're talking about plants with succession because they're the ones that do the biggest changes to the texture, pH, and water potential of soil, right? Primary succession is succession where there's an area that's never supported life before. So like a volcanic eruption creates a new island. That's where primary succession is going to occur. Secondary succession happens in an area that's already supported life, right? but there's been a disturbance of some sort, right? And so the replacement of the community, back to its natural state, is done by succession. Okay, so on land, you have pioneers coming in, usually lava flow or sand. On lava, usually it's lichens that come in, right? That's a relationship between an algae and a protist, a protist and a fungus, right? It used to be considered a commensal relationship. Now we're not actually sure if that relationship is commensal, but it's two species living together. It's a symbiotic relationship. And on the rocks, those lichens kind of put down these holdfasts that hold on to the rocks so they don't move and they can survive there. Grasses come in on sandy areas, and they again do the same thing, put down roots. But what happens is those holdfasts or the roots from grasses start to break up the soil and make it a little bit more fine, a little bit better. As they die, because it starts to become too loose for them to remain attached and be stable, that their death and decomposition puts more organic material into the soil, and that's what really kicks off succession. Okay, so it kind of goes from there. In secondary succession, you can actually start at any point in the process of succession. So, a lot of times there's an area, for example, that has a pine forest, and they want to preserve a pine forest. The pine forest is usually considered in the temperate zone to be the second to the last step of succession. The pine forests are generally replaced in our area by temperate deciduous forests. And so if you want to keep succession frozen at the pine forest state, you burn, you do forest fires, you do controlled burns to do that. That's the disruption that we're talking about. You stop succession at that point. And like I said, scientists are some scientists disagree that the changes are quite as orderly as what you're seeing here. Okay, so here's an old field. Okay, the disturbance to this ecosystem is that the farmer retires, sells his land, whatever, stops farming it. Okay, and so you get invasion by the pioneer species, right? But as those pioneer species die and make the soil finer and add some of that organic material back into the soil, they're replaced by longer lived herbaceous species and grasses. This is an early successional community, right? As they die and improve the soil even more, they're replaced by a mid-successional community. Here it's the shrubs, right? And then you also get some small trees that come in and invade. After a while, you start to get the later successional communities, longer living trees, and then finally you get the long-lived mature trees as your climax community. All right, and typically it goes in that pattern. Now, succession also happens in water, in aquatic ecosystems. Usually what happens is you start with a lake or a pond, and that lake or pond starts to fill in. Okay, so you get silt deposition in it, and the bottom of it starts to rise, and it converts to a marsh-like state, and then that marsh is replaced by a meadow that has lots of grasses, and then it's replaced eventually by a climax community with native vegetation. So those are just, again, a set of these orderly changes that can happen in the environment or in the community.